So welcome, dear friends. I'm Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitude Center Zoom session with our special guest today, Rivera's son, who will be speaking on people, power, peacemaking movements. And you can find many other great upcoming Zooms at www.beatitudecenter.org. Please let me remind everyone first to go ahead and mute yourselves and to write any questions in the chat link. Rivera will speak, I hope, for 45 minutes or even longer, and then take questions and comments for up to 45 minutes. And so please join in with your questions and comments. And we will later send out the recording link. After the recording is over, I'll stay on for a few minutes to debrief if anyone wants to chat a little bit about the program. So let's begin with a little prayer. And so I invite everybody just to take a deep breath and to relax and notice how you're feeling today in this world of violence and war, but also beauty and love. And so I invite you into the presence of the God of peace who loves you infinitely. And let's welcome the nonviolent Jesus here into our Beatitude Center and community. And take a moment in silence to ask for whatever graces and blessings of peace that you need or what you want to pray for the world. God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us. Be with us now as we reflect with our friend Rivera on the people, power, peacemaking movements in recent history, that we might be inspired, energized, renewed, and strengthened to stand strong against the culture of war and injustice, that we might support and join and build up the grassroots movements against war, injustice, racism, sexism, poverty, gun violence, nuclear weapons, and environmental destruction, that we might welcome your reign of universal love, universal peace, and total nonviolence here on earth, that we might be who you created us to be, beatitude peacemakers, your beloved sons and daughters. We ask this mighty blessing in Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So, dear friends, welcome. For those who are uh, watching the recording, we're recording this just a week or so after our friend, my dear friend and teacher and mentor, and Rivera's too, Reverend James Lawson, has died, and at the age of 96. So we honor him and remember him, who did two incredible Zooms here in the Beatitude Center, one that I typed out all the whole transcript, which you can get at beatitudecenter.org. And so it's really fitting that we honor Jim Lawson by hearing one of his great student, their son, carry on his work. So I'm very happy to welcome my friend and colleague, Rivera's son. Rivera works with Pace Ibeni, the great peace group, which I used to work with, and she carries on the work of Jim Lawson and Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan by teaching nonviolence and the global grassroots movements of nonviolence and encouraging people to do their part in the movements. She's written many books and novels, including The Dandelion Insurrection and the award-winning Ari Hour series. She's the editor of Nonviolence News and the program coordinator for Campaign Nonviolence at paceibeni.org. Her articles are syndicated by Peace Voice and published in hundreds of journals nationwide. She serves on the advisory board of World Beyond War and the board of Backbone Campaign. And I encourage you to visit her website, riverason.com. She's coming to us live today from Maine, right at the top on the border of Canada. And my connection is bad because I'm traveling. Hers should be okay. And so Welcome, everybody, and please join me in giving a very warm welcome and a round of applause to Rivera's son. Rivera, you seem frozen on my end, but everybody go ahead and shake your hands and show me that we're still alive and kicking. And Rivera, I'm going to mute myself and hand it over to you. You're very welcome here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you so much for these regular gatherings in which you learn, study, reflect, and go forth to put into practice the things that you have heard. These kind of spaces are so important for the nonviolence movement and for peace and justice in our world. So thank you. So many of us, whenever a war breaks out, people always ask that question, how can we stop it? Right? And it's such an important question. And as a war escalates, it becomes more and more urgent and more dear to our hearts to find robust and meaningful and practical answers, especially when they are rooted in strategies that rely on ordinary people like us. We often hear the narratives of war be told as this politician stopped the war, or those ambassadors wrote a peace deal, or these generals called it quits on the battlefield or won a decisive victory. But in today's presentation, we're going to talk about how ordinary people like us use nonviolent action to stop, replace, prevent, and bring to a close wars that have happened all over the globe. So if you can do one thing for me, if you can open up your chat box, just put in the chat box on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being not possible at all, and 10 being yes, absolutely possible. We do it all the time. How possible do you think it is for ordinary people like us to stop war? All right, we got a 9, we got a 2. All right, we got the full spectrum there. Love it. We got some 8s and 2s and 9s. Okay. All right, so we've got a range. Now we got some folks in the middle, like, yeah, maybe sometimes, maybe not. Yeah. Okay, great. So there is no wrong answer to this. It's not like we're going to kick you off the Zoom call if you have the wrong the wrong number on the page. We're going to check back in with this at the end and see how you feel. If you picked a high number, congratulations. You are among a rare group of people who has great faith in the peace movement. If you picked a lower number, you know what? Congratulations. You're among a lot of people who feel the same way as you. And we'll see if that shifts over today. So I'm going to share my screen and start introducing the many stories that we're going to look at today. Here we go. So we're going to look at how people have prevented a war, replaced a war, which I look at as the ultimate prevention. We're also going to look at how people have worked to win wars using nonviolent tactics. And I'll explain why that's important to think about in peace movements when we get there. We're going to look at how people have carved out space for peace, even amidst war. We're going to look at how they hastened the end of a war or wrapped it up if it was dragging its feet. And then we're going to look even further at how people have dismantled pieces of the war machine with an eye to how that we can prevent wars from happening in the first place. And to do this, we're going to look at how people have built long-lasting nonviolent infrastructure for security and defense. These are two of human needs, and we need to meet them some other way if we can. So a few disclaimers. I'm going to tell you a lot of stories, but the truth is we don't have all the answers to this yet. We are just scratching the surface of these stories, and further research is needed. So think of today as like an introduction to the topic, and know that there are far more examples of these kind of stories than we commonly think or that we're going to have a chance to talk about today. The one thing to keep in mind is that because of the way that we tell history, there are many narratives around each one of these struggles. It is very rare to hear anyone say, oh, a nonviolent movement stopped a war, right? So you're much more likely to hear the idea of there was a decisive battle on the battlefield. And sometimes there's another part of the story which has to do with how people power made it possible for one group to back out of that war. So listen for those. There are some distinctions between these kinds of struggles and what I call peacetime struggles, but that's small, and we will talk about it when we get there. So let's look at the first category, replacing war. So nonviolent struggle provides a set of tools through which people are standing up for very important social justice goals, and indeed the things that people go to war to win to begin with. We now know from the work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Stephan that nonviolent action is twice as successful as violent means. It works in a third of the amount of time and has 1/10 of the casualties. These are in campaigns specifically to overturn a governmental regime, so a dictator, expel a foreign invasion, or end an occupation. All three of these scenarios are things that we commonly see people use violence for, and we also see people increasingly using nonviolence for. Beyond just those examples, when I edit nonviolence news, I see examples every single week of how people have chosen to pick up boycotts and strikes, occupations, protests, marches, blockades, shutdowns, sit-ins, and in so doing, they have chosen not to pick up armed struggle to achieve those goals. Every time people do this, they have replaced a war with nonviolent struggle. So the leading edge of the peace movement is actually the use of nonviolent struggle for social justice goals. Because without it, we would either have to be passively complicit in injustice and sometimes our own oppression, or we would have to pick up guns and weapons and try to fight our way out of the situation with violence. So think about that a little bit as you hear stories of nonviolent action. Every single one of these could have been an armed struggle, and every single one of these is not. But we'll take the example of Bolivia. In 2019, they had an election that was very similar to our 2020 election, in which the sitting president, Evo Morales, was running for re-election, and the right wing cast doubt on the election results. This grew into some mass protests in the streets by the right wing that then turned violent and then got the military generals to back their position, threatening a coup, which forced Evo Morales to flee the country, and the right wing came to power. They had an interim president, Jeanette Áñez, who kept delaying the new elections. So here is where it could have gone violent. It very easily could have become a civil war. Instead, the left wing of the country mobilized mass demonstrations. They shut down the country with roadblocks. They held general strikes and more limited strikes in industries and forced her to hold an election. In that election, a new left-wing candidate won. The elections were certified as credible, and they have moved on to a new chapter of their country's history without going through a civil war. We can also look at the examples of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and indeed a few other nations who exited the Soviet Union using nonviolent struggle in 1989. Every single one of these struggles could have been violent, and in the case of Lithuania in particular, they had already waged a violent war to try to achieve the same goals. These nonviolent revolutions were against the very country, the Soviet Union and Russia, that the US was spending trillions of dollars on building nuclear weapons to defeat. These people have done it. A third story I'd like us to think about happened recently in 2021. The Zapatistas have not always been nonviolent, and in fact, they were pretty famously violent revolutionaries from the indigenous groups, the Zapatistas, in Mexico. They more recently sailed a boat to Spain on the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Spaniards in Mexico, and they nonviolently held a mock invasion of Spain to protest colonialism, to say how insane it is to come to another person's country, plant your flag, and say, I own this now. If the Zapatistas had chosen to bring their guns with them, this could have turned into a bloodbath. Certainly, they would have been met with the Spanish army and arrests. Instead, they were welcomed by people all throughout Spain. They did a massive tour. They successfully talked about colonialism in meaningful ways, and nobody was arrested. When we look at indigenous peoples, we see that over and over and over again, they are at the forefront of using nonviolent tactics to assert their sovereignty, resist colonization and occupation, and achieve human rights and social justice for their peoples. This is a understudied branch of nonviolent struggle, and it is a profound example of how nations, because when we decolonize our thinking and recognize that the native tribes all over the world see themselves, and in many cases have won back their legal sovereignty as nations, are using nonviolent struggle to kick out particularly state-backed corporate powers like fossil fuel companies or mining companies. It's a really profound example of how all nations could actually be using these same tactics to defend their countries. Replacing war with nonviolent struggle happens all the time. We see it in things like Chile ousting their dictatorship, India's self-rule movement with Gandhi, even the US civil rights movement is a good example of that. That easily could have been a violent armed struggle and was not. So next, let's look at preventing war. When we see that a war is brewing, there are many ways to use nonviolent action to actually thwart it. One of the best examples of this, most dramatic that I have heard about, happened in Algeria in 1962. Now, you might remember that the Algerians had a brutal and bloody war of independence. It was 7 years long to get rid of France, that was their colonizing power. But immediately after that, the two political parties in Algeria, in newly independent Algeria, splintered and couldn't come to an agreement about anything and descended into civil war in August 1962. Immediately, 20,000 people rallied in the capital and held a vote to go on general strike to stop this war. In addition, in the next few weeks and months, thousands of citizens stood in front of the two armies. They laid down in the roads, they blocked the tanks and the troops, and they negotiated more limited ceasefires to stop this war as it was breaking out. Due to these civilian protests, the two armies ended their fighting by the end of September. This is a profound example. What makes it even more powerful is that it was not without casualties. 1,000 people died during this time. Now, usually when a war is escalating, we see that as soon as people start getting killed, it just starts escalating more and more and more and more because, people want revenge, they want vengeance, they use it to justify their violence. Instead, the people of Algeria were clear. 7 years of brutal war was enough. We will not have a civil war on top of this. An interesting example happened in Niger in 2023. Now, Niger also was a French colony. They are ostensibly independent, but France still exerts a outsized influence on the country to the dissatisfaction of the people. France also had 1,500 troops in the country, and Niger wanted them out. And a military coup actually came to power. So this is not necessarily ideal. It's not a democratic election, but the people supported the military coup. And when France tried to get ECOWAS, which is kind of like the African NATO, let's say, to come and put down the military coup, the people of Niger turned out in mass protests against it. They called upon their fellow Africans to do similarly in their countries. And in the case of Nigeria, this was successful in getting Nigeria to do a 180 on supporting or not supporting the ECOWAS troops going to Niger. The Niger people were actually successful in getting France to withdraw their troops, and they're in another chapter of their struggle for self-determination. And we'll see how it plays out from here. In 1905, this photo is from 1909, but I couldn't actually find one from 1905. Sweden and Norway were actually the same exact country. Sweden had invaded and conquered Norway, but independence for Norway was brewing. Now, the Swedish elites were not happy about this. They said, as soon as Norway tries to get their independence, we're going to reinvade and reconquer them. But the common working people and the unions that organized them were like, hell no, that is not going to happen. And they threatened to hold a general strike against the war. They held mass demonstrations and rallies to show that they were prepared to do this. And when the independence vote happened in the parliament, in Sweden's parliament, the king of Sweden told the elites that there would be absolutely no military action because of it. And this was because the people of the two countries said, we will not fight. Their organizing was really robust. Think about it, in 1905, I don't quite have their populations in my head, but they printed 100,000 anti-war leaflets and distributed them. They really worked within their unions to make this happen, which meant that they could put pressure on not just the politics, but the business and the commerce of the country as well. Some of you may remember, if we use a US example, when the US was escalating armed struggle and war in El Salvador and Nicaragua, and brutal, brutal wars. The Pledge of Resistance was organized to get people to pledge that they were willing to do direct action. And at first, in the first iterations of it, it was to go to Nicaragua and literally stand between the armed, violent paramilitaries and the civilians. And then later that evolved into doing direct action in the US to stop the war. The pledge got around 40,000 signers at first, and then it swelled to 80,000 signers as it looked like the war would actually escalate. And thousands of people turned out for direct action. There was a 40-day hunger strike. People blockaded trains to stop military munitions. There was a year-long blockade of a training facility that shut it down with thousands of people for the entire year. And indeed, this campaign was successful in getting us to back out of those two struggles. There were one of the things to know about this is that it was a great use of a preparatory pledge, right? So let's say we're going to do something. Let's flex our muscle a little bit and warn our power holders that if they do something, if they escalate, we are ready to push back. It's a powerful tactic. So, when we are prepared, when we are trained with nonviolent struggle, we can pull off the quite astonishing things. In the people power revolution in the Philippines, when the people were trying to get rid of the dictator Ferdinand Marcos, there was a very tense moment. Millions of people were in the streets after Marcos tried to steal the election. And there was a military general who rebelled against Marcos and said, we will fight you. We are ready to fight for our country. This is so inspiring. All these people are rising up. We're ready to start a war and get you out. And Marcos actually summoned his loyal troops and said, go put down the rebellion, go kill them. And this would have become a civil war. No two ways about it. It would have happened, except there were millions of people in the streets. And the Catholic Church, in particular, called upon them to go stand between the two armies. and to tell them, no, do not go to war. Support what is going on in the street, support the nonviolent effort, put down your guns, and let us handle this peacefully, which is ultimately what happened. And they got Ferdinand Marcos out, and Corazon Aquino became the new president. So it's not just big movements that can prevent war either. Sometimes it is the right person in the right place at the right time. And in 1983, this was Stanislav Petrov. He was on duty at a nuclear facility in Russia, or the USSR, and they got a warning that the US was attacking with nuclear weapons. They were on their way. Now, Stanislav Petrov thought this might not be true. It might be a false alarm. And he said, no, I'm not going to fire back. I'm not going to send our nukes back. And he was ordered to do this. And he said, no, it's just too risky. And he was ordered to do it again, and he refused again. They threatened to court-martial him. They threatened to kick him out. And he just wouldn't do it. Well, it turned out it was a false alarm. There were no missiles on their way from the US. And because of Stanislav Petrov, we averted nuclear war, and we are all standing here today having this conversation because of this man. If you are ever in his position, please do not push the button and drop that bomb. The ability of people to prevent war is actually happening all the time. Most of the time, it is never categorized by historians. It is never captured. It is never seen. We avert it in ways that are at smaller scales than when the tanks come to fight each other. This is true in 2017, which some of you might remember, Trump was escalating war with North Korea. And the South Korean people, the North Korean people, and the US people all did protests against this. And Trump did a 180, as he so often does, and took credit for stopping a war with North Korea. When in reality, it was the people. So, we have to be aware that, peace actions succeed all the time, and we do not count the victories. So let's take a little pause, and if you could put into the chat box one word that's coming to mind as you hear these stories. Go ahead and put in the chat box one word that comes to mind as you're listening to these stories. All right, lots of hope, possibility, power, amazing, trust, courage, unbelievable. I know it's kind of astonishing. Large turnouts in many of these cases. It is an important part of nonviolent struggle. Gratitude, wonder, Gaza. Yeah, how could some of these be used in the current situations? Thank you all. So let's keep looking because there are more stories to share. Oops, let's not share that screen. Oh, one more time. If at first you don't succeed with tech, you just try again. There we go. So I want to talk a little bit about working to win a war with nonviolent tactics. Because when Russia invaded Ukraine recently, there was a situation in which people in the peace movement felt like they didn't want to oppose the war because they felt that Ukraine had a right to defend itself. And where they were kind of in a quandary, right? They didn't want to just say to Ukrainians, lay over and take it. So it's important to know the stories of how people can actually work to stand up for just grievances, for things that we think that we should stand up against, but using nonviolent struggle. To illustrate this point, I want to talk a little bit about the nonviolent resistance to the Nazis. Contrary to popular belief, there was actually widespread nonviolent resistance to the Nazis, largely because in many of the occupied territories, the civilian population was disarmed, right? They didn't have access to guns, the Nazis took them all away. So, but they did have access to tools of nonviolent struggle. And with these, they denied the Nazis their objectives over and over and over again and made the occupation of their countries very costly for the Nazis to maintain. This looked like things like the Dutch bankers who secretly and covertly, first of all, hid millions of dollars from the Nazis, second of all, funded millions of dollars into resistance movements all over Europe. Now, some of this, of course, went to the armed resistance flanks, because some of them did have arms. But in particular, one of the things that they did was they funded a railroad workers' strike that pivotally crippled not the Germans at an important part of the war. Because when the railroad workers went on strike and they could maintain that strike for weeks because they had a well-funded strike fund, the Nazis couldn't move their weapons, munitions, and supplies around Europe. There are many other stories as well. Many of us have heard about how the Danish saved 6,000, almost 95% of their Jews from the Nazis on the eve of the rollout of the roundup of the Jews, and they ferried them to Sweden. This is a powerful act of nonviolent action in the midst of a war. We also saw that the Norwegian teachers 30,000 of them refused to implement a fascist curriculum. They were rounded up, they were put on trains, and they were sent to work camps, but they did not actually ever implement that curriculum, and they saved the minds of their children from indoctrination. The tactics of nonviolent struggle are actually so powerful that even the US government recommended them in their espionage and sabotage manuals of the 1940s, so during the war. They would train people to do things like work slowly. Think of ways to increase the number of movements necessary to do your job, a light hammer instead of a heavy one. This was used by the Danish shipyard workers. One of the big goals that the Germans had in occupying Denmark in particular was to use their shipyards to build more warships. So the Danish workers would literally screw in bolts very slowly. And when the Nazis weren't looking, they would unscrew the bolts. This was so successful that by the end of years of occupation during the war, the Danes had not built a single warship for the Nazis. And if you don't think that had a direct impact on the Germans losing the war, you're kidding yourself. So nonviolent struggle, that's what we're talking about. This list is both funny and kind of inspiring. There are things on it like, whenever possible, make really long speeches at meetings with the Nazis so they can't get anything done. Personally, so I have seen activists use that same tactic on me, and it's super annoying, but it really does work to sabotage getting anything accomplished. So another example I'd like to share that is little known happened during the US Civil War. There were about 4 million enslaved African Americans at that time. The population of the entire United States was 31 million. During the Civil War, 800,000 African Americans left their enslavement, ran off of the plantations, and made their way north to Union camps and refugee settlements. This was about 20% of the enslaved population did this. What is powerful about this is that we never actually calculate this or include this in our narratives of what helped us win or lose the Civil War. But if you can imagine 20% of your workforce disappearing, you can imagine the havoc that this caused in the South. The delays, the slowdowns, the shipments, the lack of ability to get things done. I think it is also an important narrative of direct action by enslaved people to directly rebel against enslavement. 800,000 people. This is one of the largest direct action campaigns in US history, and we are not calculating it in our accounts of how our history happened and what went down. We also saw during the Algerian War of Independence that many French people turned out in support of Algerian independence, putting the pressure on President Charles de Gaulle to agree to the independence. And then just to come back for a minute to Ukraine, we have seen numerous examples of nonviolent action to resist occupation. In one town in particular, even though there were air grenades going off overhead, thousands of people came out into the streets to nonviolently resist the occupation. The Russians had actually seized their mayor, and because of these mass demonstrations, they won the return of their mayor and the leaving of the Russian soldiers from their town. The funny thing was, the only thing that they had to capitulate on and give up were their guns. So when the Russians were like, okay, we'll leave you alone, they were like, but you have to give us your guns. And what makes this kind of funny to me is that these people did not need those guns to liberate themselves from Russia. They actually did it quite effectively with nonviolent tactics. Now, of course, the broader scope of the war and the invasion continues, and this is a very limited and isolated example, but it is illustrative of kind of the seeds of ideas through which we could think about grand strategies to do a larger scale resistance. So to think about this, when we're working to win, one of the things that happens with nonviolent tactics is that it mobilizes unarmed populations, gives us other tools with which to wage the struggle. This, of course, broadens the resistance because you don't need to know how to fire a gun. You don't need a gun. You don't need to be in great health or shape. There are many ways to resist. It can help us achieve limited goals even under occupation. And it can deny our occupiers their objectives, which can be costly for them in terms of what they're trying to achieve in even waging a war in the first place. These struggles can be a little distinct from peacetime struggles in that ordinarily, when we have a nonviolent campaign, we try to make really clear and firm distinctions between us and any violent flanks that might be also saying that they're fighting for the same goals. Amidst war zones, this distinction doesn't actually seem to be as critically important. So that is something to keep in mind. Again, this is an understudied aspect of civil resistance that would really benefit from a lot more research. We do know that these narratives are grossly overshadowed by the violent narratives of war and underestimated in our calculations of what won that war. How did we win? So I'm going to give you a chance to chime in on the chat box. Were there any tactics or strategies that you just heard that you think would be particularly important for people to know about? You can think about in Gaza or Ukraine or any of the war zones that are currently active around the world. Any examples that we're like, oh, maybe we could do something like that? Go ahead and put those in the chat box. Yeah, so non-cooperating with the goals of the occupying military, protest in the streets, peaceful protests, people lying down in the road to prevent troops from moving. Yeah, learning these stories. Absolutely, Crystal. Great, thank you. Absolutely, Carolyn. Your comment, the Palestinians have a really robust, long history of nonviolent action against occupation and colonization. Interesting, Glenn. A pledge of resistance if NATO gets involved in Ukraine. Gathering in the streets to protest arms sales. Yes, Donna, how teachers refuse to teach certain curriculums, or in our case here in the US, often it is teaching just some kind of like a basic knowledge of history that is just and fair. So a proactive teaching of an alternate curriculum. Yes, and Kathy says refusing to miseducate youth. So important. We'll see in an example to come that, you know, in the case of Czechoslovakia, one failed nonviolent struggle 30 years later they wound up having a successful nonviolent struggle. And, 30 years, what happens in that time? Either you have your youth on board or you lose them, right? Either they become little Nazis or they become nonviolent revolutionaries. So yes, maintaining the control of education is important. All right, great ideas. Oh goodness, here we go again. Let's fix that. Let's hear a few more stories, this time about what do you do when a war is like dragging on and on? How do we start to carve out space for peace and bring it to a close? We now know from research that limited ceasefires and local zones of peace actually play a significant role in bringing warring parties to a complete and lasting ceasefire. Groups like Nonviolent Peace Force work in hot conflict zones all over the world to protect civilians, to de-escalate military tensions, to provide protective accompaniment for things like humanitarian relief supplies. The idea of a peace team is that you train groups of people in the pragmatic strategies of de-escalation, and that it gives you an alternative to using armed defense. The idea comes from both M.K. Gandhi, who was a proponent of it, and this man on the left, Badshah Khan, who was a Pashtun man who lived in regions that are now Afghanistan and India. And so he had 80,000 people who were trained in nonviolent struggle. They withstood the worst of the British repression and violence during the Gandhi self-rule struggle. And this, he called it a nonviolent army. This gave rise in part to the idea of the Shanti Sena, which would go into places where, say, Hindus and Muslims were doing horrific violence to one another and work to de-escalate that and stop the violence. Today, it is not just Nonviolent Peace Force, but also groups like Peace Brigade and Brigades International, Meta Peace Teams, DC Peace Teams, Community Peace Teams, who continue this work. We also see some examples that are little tiny oases of peace, things like the Syrian underground library that collects books out of rubble and creates a literal underground library where people can go to experience a moment of peace in the war zone. This is important for keeping people's hope alive, for giving them breathing room. We've also seen that they call them limited ceasefires, can be negotiated on the ground by community members in powerful ways. In one particular city in Yemen, there was a problem where a water source had gotten destroyed in the war, and it was causing tension as people from one area of the city went to another area of the city to get their water at a shared well, the one remaining well. This had led to even gunshots being fired and a child getting killed while trying to get water. So this went on for 30 years, back and forth, lots of violence, lots of chapters. And young women from this community helped to negotiate a peace agreement. And in part, they did this by doing peace building in the community and getting the deciding parties into a room together. And these were all men. They were not coming to a decision quickly, so the women marched in and sat down and broke the taboo against women being part of these talks and said, no, today, here, now is how we solve this. In the end, they got the men to agree to help to work together to rebuild the other well, so that now two wells existed in the community. People could access water safely. Another example of this limited territorial ceasefire that can occur happened in Colombia amidst the 50-year-long civil war. The Colombian peace villages, in particular San Jose de Arpatado, um, said that they would neither join the Colombian military and so nor support them, nor would they support the rebel factions in the civil war. And they said, our village is going to be a peace village. All guns and weapons need to be left at the gate, and no one may enter and do any violence. Even when they faced a massacre by one of the armed groups, they continued their commitment to this peace village, and it exists to today. So all of these strategies help to even put the idea that peace is possible into people's heads. And this is critically important because all wars must end. And it really is a question of how soon can we get them to end, right? How soon can we get this to end with the least amount of casualties? In 2003, the women of Liberia, they had just gone through a horrific civil war in which rape was used as a weapon of war, in which the casualties were high, and women and children were the greatest, were specifically targeted and attacked. As a second civil war was brewing, the women, well, in particular, Lima Gabowi had a dream in which God came to her and said, "Gather the women and pray for peace." And by that, she knew he meant gather the Muslim women and the Christian women and pray publicly for peace. So they sat at a fish market day after day after day. And this was along the route of the dictator, Charles Taylor. He could not leave his palace, go and do anything without seeing these women holding these signs, demanding peace. After months of doing this, they succeeded in getting the rebels and Charles Taylor to agree to peace talks. And they, again, just like in Yemen, the men got in a room and they weren't getting anything done. They were grandstanding, they were posturing, they were making fun of one another, but they weren't making a peace agreement. So the women of Liberia surrounded the building and blocked the doors and said, "You're not coming out till you come out with a peace agreement." And the guards went to arrest them. So Lima Gabowi got up and she said, "If you lay one finger on me, I will take off all my clothes." Now, to us, we're like, what? That doesn't make sense. But in Africa, many African traditions believe that when an older woman threatens to publicly disrobe in front of you, it is a curse upon you and your family. So the guards actually backed off and they said, "Oh, no, 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 we're not going to get involved in this." And because of that, the men inside the building sat down, made a peace accord, and came out with it. This was at a critical juncture when the rebel army was literally marching on the capital city of Monrovia. Had the women of Liberia delayed, had they not surrounded that building, that war would have massacred the civilian population of the capital city. Instead, Charles Taylor resigned, and they had democratic elections, and they elected their first woman president, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, who was part of this movement. We see similar patterns in Northern Ireland at the end of the Troubles. When we see it between the Catholics and the Protestants and these 100 years of fighting back and forth, it took the community of peace people and their 50,000 person demonstrations week after week on Saturdays to push the country to the point where peace was even possible. There were only about 3 million people in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Ireland at the time. So 50,000 people is an incredible amount of people, well over what that 3.5% of the populace that Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan identified as being necessary to win a nonviolent struggle. They forced peace to get on the agenda of the politicians, and they even put it to a popular vote, a referendum in which people actually voted on the peace accords. One of the earliest examples of people bringing war to a close happened around 1142 CE. That's kind of when we think it happened according to the astrological evidence. Um, when the five tribes that are now known as the Haudenosaunee, they had been at war back and forth, one tribe against another, or nation against another for years. And the great peacemaker and Hiawatha went from one tribe to the next, getting people to agree to sit down for peace. They gathered under the tree that you see on their flag, and they agreed to bury the hatchet. If you've ever heard that phrase, bury the hatchet, it comes from this peace accord. They established the Great Law of Peace, in which they set out new rules of governance between their nations, and it is still in effect to this day. So here we get into one of the stories where, remember I told you that history doesn't account for this. It tells us different narratives. When we think about what we think stopped World War I, we certainly don't think it was the people. But many of us have heard the story of the Christmas Day truce when French and German soldiers literally put down their guns in the trenches, got up and had a Christmas Day celebration together, playing football, sharing food, sharing cigarettes. Now, the next day, they went back to fighting each other. But this so spooked the generals that when the next Christmas rolled around, they forbid it on pain of not just court-martialing, but death. Because they knew that if they allowed the soldiers to have ceasefire and get to know each other, they would rebel against the idea of fighting any more trench warfare. And indeed, this was the case in 1918. So in 1918, Germany withdrew its high fleet to do repairs and get them ready to go back out again and fight the naval battles. Uh, when they were in docks, there was a movement among the sailors to refuse to fight anymore. The Germans rounded up the four ringleaders of this and they executed them. This so infuriated the naval sailors that they organized a walkout, which is what you're looking at here, and they left the ships and they said, "We absolutely refuse to fight any longer in this war." Because of this action and the ripple effect through other striking laborers throughout Italy and Germany and other branches of the military, the German high command knew that they did not have the soldiers who would fight the war. This led to their capitulation and to their surrender. This is what ended World War I. History is powerful, and when we know it, it actually really helps us understand our potential in the present. One of the stories I've been talking a lot about recently, because of what's going on in Gaza, is the example of East Timor. Uh, East Timor was suffering under a genocide perpetrated by Indonesia, which was occupying it at its time. They had been fighting for independence for close to 100 years. They had had chapters of armed uprising, outright war, nonviolent struggles, and at this point in time, they were facing a genocide. The East Timorese used a high-profile public event to raise international awareness of their plight. And this prompted international solidarity movements to form, including in Australia, the UK, across Europe, throughout Asia, but significantly also in the United States. The US campaign put the pressure on the president to end military aid to Indonesia. And they were successful in doing this. Almost immediately after military aid ceased going to Indonesia, President Suharto, who had been in power and perpetrating the genocide, lost power and was kicked out of power, and his regime actually crumbled. East Timor got their independence within 6 to 9 months, and within 18 months had a fully independent and functioning government because of the US campaign to end military aid to Indonesia. This is a campaign that has direct relevance to our struggles to end what's going on in Gaza right now. Even when our peace efforts aren't successful or don't seem like they're going to be successful, it is critically important that we persevere anyway. Every time people stand up for peace, we open the space in our country and others for that third option to be put on the table. When a war breaks out, usually people think we have to pick this side or pick that side. And the movement for peace is a third side. It's saying we are not going to say you're right or you're wrong. What we are going to say is the violence is not the way to handle this situation and it needs to stop. And then you can get in a room and decide how this is going to play out. This is true, Afghanistan's Helmand Peace March was a great example of this. It did not end all the wars and the violence, but what it did significantly do is open up the space in Afghan society for Afghans to see how many people like them just want peace. So the last thing that we'll talk about today before I open up the floor to your questions is this idea that we can make war less likely. And to do this, we have to do things like end military bases and bombing ranges like they did in Puerto Rico. We need to get military research off of our campuses and decouple the military from our places of learning and education. We need to stop military maneuvers from happening all over and demilitarize our public spaces, as they did in Montenegro. We need to resist military expansion, whether that's in the budget or that's actually establishing a military or building up more troops, as the Japanese are facing. And one of the things we can know about is this idea that all of these strategies we've been talking about can be put together in an idea of an alternative form of defense for our nations. It's marked by planning and preparation. It's not just ad hoc. We don't just do it when we're invaded. Ideally, it can deter other armies from attacking us. It has really specific ways that it works to resist, and we've talked about many of them today. It's not totally unthinkable. Switzerland uses something they call total defense, and they integrate both these kind of nonviolent tactics into all of their plans. They have military and non-military anti-invasion plans. They use the metaphor of being like a hedgehog, prickly and notoriously hard to swallow, as a way of deterring other people from occupying them. The shipyard story from Denmark is a good example of this. Czechoslovakia actually tried to do this in 1968 when the Soviets invaded them. They even changed street signs, they had mass demonstrations, they had a whole set of commandments that when a Soviet soldier comes to you, you don't know, don't care, don't tell, don't have, don't know how to, don't give, can't do, can't tell, don't show, do nothing. Right? Total non-cooperation with the invaders and the occupiers. They came very close to succeeding in this struggle. And in fact, to make a long story short, the only reason they didn't succeed was the lack of communication between their representatives who went to Moscow to negotiate for them and what was happening on the ground in Czechoslovakia. These were the days before internet and cell phones, and had they been able to reach their people, the negotiators would have known whether or not they could have held strong. Instead, the negotiators caved to what the Soviets were telling them, and the Soviets occupied. However, less than 30 years later, the Czechoslovakians have the Velvet Revolution, in which they have a nonviolent revolution that successfully ousts the Soviets from their country, and they win their independence. This is that story I was mentioning to you of, when I first heard of this, when I was in my 20s, it was a lifetime, right? It was so long ago. Now that I'm in my 40s, that scope of time is so short. And it really shows that, one struggle can prepare us to be successful in the next moment. Lithuania, after they had a nonviolent revolution, actually implemented they put in these strategies of nonviolent resistance as a defense into their constitution. And not this most recent round with NATO, but the time before that, in let's say 2016 or 17, when NATO was kind of grumbling at Russia was grumbling at NATO maneuvers on the border. Lithuania actually reissued their civilian-based defense pamphlets to all the citizenry, and they said something like, should a larger nation, Russia, try to invade us, here is exactly how you should nonviolently resist them. This was successful in preventing an invasion from Russia over NATO's maneuvers. This strategy has also been used in Quebec to drive out the frackers, the fracking companies who wanted to drill for gas. They organized a plan of defense that showed the entire map of their town and where they could blockade the roads. And they even calculated how much it would cost the fracking company day by day as they stalled, delayed, blocked, and prevented them. They racked up millions of dollars on their civil resistance campaign plan, and then they put it out to the media. And this so frightened the investors in this natural gas project that they pulled out. And Quebec passed a ban on fracking, and they still don't have fracking to this day. So what can we do to stop war? Organize now, not when a conflict breaks out. Remember that there are harder and easier times to stop a war. Usually before it happens is easier than when it's just getting started. And then when it's lingering on and dragging on, you have another opportunity. But in the height of it, when it's really ramping up, that's the hardest time to stop them. We have to constantly study these stories and remember that to be successful, we can't just protest. We have to make plans of non-cooperation or to get in the way of the tanks or the soldiers or the things like that. We all have roles to play and they don't all look the same. One thing we can all do to prevent war is to support anti-war voices, especially among aggressors. So the Russian anti-war movement, the Israeli anti-war movement, they need our solidarity and support. If you are occupied, remember that fighting differently is an option. You may not need to pick up guns to be effective at resisting. And we don't do peace work because it's popular. Every single peace movement in history has always been vilified by both sides who are fighting until they succeed. And then the whole world is like, woo, you're our heroes. We need to continuously work at dismantling war and militarism and building peace culture. This is the best, most effective way to prevent wars. Remember that this work is not impossible, it has vast potential, and we need to research it more. We've spent 45 minutes to an hour today talking about this, but we could spend, entire school semesters studying this, a year studying this. We could build our capacity to execute these strategies on the local and national level, and that these stories give us a glimpse of what's possible. We have to remember that because war is a global issue, nonviolent resistance to war is a global field. We don't just need to learn from US stories, but from stories around the world. And we need to take it seriously. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said it well. Those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. So I will stop there. You have all been really wonderful listeners, and I'm sure that was a lot of stories. And I would love to hear your questions, but first, if you could put in the chat box on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not very possible and 10 being very possible, how possible do you think it is for ordinary people to stop wars? Okay, 10s and 8s, convince some of you. If you feel like it's still a 2, it's okay to put that in there. Yeah, we can still be in the middle. Sometimes it wins, sometimes it don't. If any of you have moved up 1 degree, I feel like today has been a worthwhile use of your time. So thank you. And now I'd love to
Well,
hear your questions.
let's give a big round of applause to Rivera. That was brilliant, Rivera. Thank you so much. Um, Certainly the most brilliant, clearest presentation I've ever seen in my life, outlining so many countless examples of people stopping war nonviolently. So on behalf of everybody, thank you, thank you, thank you. Um, so Rivera, you can check too in the chat box. Uh, if there aren't any questions, folks, if you want to raise your hand or uh, um, get our attention and we'll call on you. So let's go with Glenn's first one. Any stories of tax resistance, Rivera, that come to mind?
Glenn, I would love to learn more about tax resistance on a large scale. I definitely know smaller scale examples of people who have done tax resistance, and we certainly know about Thoreau's direct relationship with it and how it led to, the very idea of civil disobedience entering the discourse in U.S. society. But I don't know large scale examples, but I would love to know more about them.
Right. And the group that works on it most is War Resisters League. And they monitor it and structure it, and they publish an incredible book about how to do it. There's another question there, Rivera. You'll see from Paul. How can nonviolent peacemaking effectively address the collective shame, trauma of the perpetrators? And
Yeah,
maybe the
great
Truth and
question.
Reconciliation Commission of South Africa is a good example.
Yeah, there are a growing number of examples around the world. The Rwandan Truth and Reconciliation process is a very fascinating example following the genocide. Um, Nonviolent Peace Force is doing some interesting work around reintegration of former soldiers into their home communities after they defect from war. So that's more limited examples, individuals versus whole countries. But I do think, the ideas of restorative justice, reparations, and, collective forgiveness practices can be very powerful. We all witnessed the example at Standing Rock when some of the US military veterans came and did a formal apology to the tribes, the Standing Rock Sioux, and just how emotional and profound that was to have that happen. So yeah, I do think that this is an important branch that I haven't gotten a chance to collect as many stories about, but I would love to see more done with. Because if we don't heal that trauma, we see it again and again and again, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Carolyn from Vancouver wants you to reflect on martyrs. And there's so many different angles in all of this, but it is powerful, the role of the martyr, or let's call it the nonviolent martyr, in the struggle. And she says people can die either way, with a gun or without a gun. So you have Franz Jägerstätter refusing to fight, and he's going to die, and so many others in Austria uh, joining the Nazis and fighting. Um, any thoughts on how the movements have used their martyrs to enlarge the movement, in effect?
Yeah.
Nonviolent martyrs.
Right. Well, we did see that in the example of the sailors in World War One. I mean, they were not like,
Mm-hmm.
lifelong nonviolence followers. They were literally fighting a war 5 minutes before. But when they got their leaders got executed, that was a mobilization through which the other sailors honored them and honored their intentions by following through on their plans. I would say that the studies have shown that you are 10 times less likely to die using nonviolent struggle than you are using violent means. And that is true even when, in the struggles that studied, it's about resisting occupation, ending foreign invasion, rising up against dictators. So these are dangerous situations. So yeah, nonviolent struggle is not for the faint of heart, and people do sacrifice everything for it. And there are, ways to not, let's say, not be stupid while you're practicing nonviolent struggle as well. But
Mhm.
I do think, taking the risks seriously and also being committed can really make meaning out of the risks that we must take.
Rivera, Shirley Bender asked a question back a ways, and I'm going to read it to you. It says, what could have been used to de-escalate the 2020 insurrection on the US Capitol, that the government met violence with violence, which just increases hatred? Could you have a comment on that, as how could that have been done differently?
Yeah, absolutely. So groups like Nonviolent Peace Force, but also DC Peace Team, who was on the ground and did a lot of de-escalation work, but they were in a different part of the Capitol, can be really helpful in diffusing a situation like that versus antagonizing it and escalating it. But I would say, to really understand that moment, we need to rewind the clock 6 months to the people who came together to stop Trump from actually successfully bluffing his way into stealing that election. People like George Lakey and Daniel Hunter mobilized thousands and thousands of people, and people like Hardy Merriman and the Protect Democracy team, or Hold the Line team, successfully train people in civil resistance to uphold the election results. There was also another wing of it that reached out to media people and said, look, you cannot call this election on the night of. Your line has to be, we need to count all the votes, and it's going to take time. Because of this, the pillars of society around the 2020 election actually held strong. And when Trump got on television and tried to bluster his way and be like, I won, the answer to that was a resounding, we have not counted all the votes yet, which meant that what happened on January 6th was 10 times to 100 times smaller than it could have been. So this is something to remember. Like, if we want to prevent an even bigger problem from happening,
David Hartzell, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, Poon.
No, Rivera was still saying something. Go ahead.
I
Rivera.
I might have cut off
Oh,
on
she
that then.
froze on my, sorry, Rivera, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, that's all right. So yeah, just if we want to prevent an even bigger problem happening, start early and keep going, basically.
So Rivera, thank you so much for all your inspiring examples. Very important for all of us. And I wish the whole world could hear this. Um, my question is, in some of the areas where there have been, major nonviolent revolutions that have overthrown occupation and dictatorship, like India, Philippines, Sudan, and Egypt, they've later been overthrown or forgotten about.
Mhm.
In the case of India, what can we learn? Not only how do we overthrow oppressive governments and make end wars, but then how can we maintain that peaceful, just society, democratic?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. At this point, we have a lot of research in how people have ousted dictatorships or ended fascist governments. What we don't have as many stories circulating about is how they prevented them from getting to power in the first place. We have a few, like the resistance to the Kapp Putsch in Germany in 1920, which is a great example. But I think we need to know how to both prevent them from arising and actually create a bedrock infrastructure which is far more resilient than anything we've seen so far in any of the so-called democracies around the world. How do we inure every pillar of power and every system of government from the inroads of ideologies of hate, oppression, and injustice? This is a great question for our movements in these times. Otherwise, no matter how successful we are at getting rid of the worst offenders, we are still vulnerable to the next person on the block who wants to seize power. So that's not an answer to your question, maybe more an empathetic, like, I also want to know the answer to that question.
Thank you. I've been thinking so much since Trump about how in 1920, Rivera and David, Gandhi said, unless democracies institutionalize nonviolence, they have to move to fascism. They have to move to fascism. And we've seen that in David, that's kind of what you're addressing. But I don't think we've ever really seen a nation institutionalize nonviolence, which is the next step. And it's the civilian-based defense. So you have examples like Costa Rica, maybe Norway and Sweden, but so it's almost inevitable, and that's something, but we're all just trying to put out fires. Okay, two things, Rivera. Donna asks, how can I bring your presentation to my Pax Christi group? I would say, Donna, first of all, and then I want to ask you, Rivera. So this is being recorded, Donna, and will be posted on the Beatitude Center free YouTube channel. And once it's there, all you have to do is sign up. It doesn't cost anything. And then you have access to these things. Beatitude Center, if you type that in. And then you can show that to everyone. And I hope you will, because this was so brilliant. Rivera, how can people get access to other Zooms you're doing, or can they invite you to come and speak to their group or give this Zoom to their group?
Yes, all of the above. So you can share this Zoom with your group. This is a talk that I do often give and I love giving. But there are this recording and other recordings are out there so that people can access it at any resource level. You can send me an email at info@riverasun.com. I will put that in the chat box for you. And we can talk about doing this with your group if you want. I also have a 6-week version of this talk now that we do it as a class and we study it more in depth, and you get to apply some of the ideas to think about. So if you want to go in depth, we can do that. And if you want to know about other talks and lectures that I'm giving, I will put my website link into the chat box, which is where you can find out what's coming up.
Great, Rivera. So you'll have to come and do another one for us. I'm wondering if you have a talk, or if you could write one for us for a year from now, kind of part 2. So we were looking today at the last century mainly. I'm wondering if you could give a talk on like the top 40 movements happening right now on the planet, that the outcome is not known. But, when I was in Rome, we were hearing incredible stories, Ken Budigan and I, about from Africa, of movements we had no idea about, that were actually ending war and then trying to prevent a future war. And then that would also include the bigger horrors like nuclear weapons, so ICAN, and climate change. I wonder, do you have a presentation like that, or could you do one for us and test it out on us? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have to think about that. That's a lot of work, John. Gosh.
Hey, Rivera.
I will mull on that. I mean, I guess it's hard to narrow down what are in the top 40, but
okay, the top 20. You could do the
I
top
think
20.
what might be very interesting to do is like the top 20 smart and savvy moves that current movements are doing, right? Who's doing what that is so brilliant we should all know about it? Like the LA hotel workers that Reverend Lawson helped to coach, who have been doing a rolling strike against 100 hotels and are so close to getting a really amazing contract at all of them. Such a smart strategy going on there. Or Extinction Rebellion and how they're holding a biodiversity march today where people are literally dressing up like their favorite fun and endangered creatures throughout England. Their tactical tool set is just extraordinary. So anyway, yes, I think what are the best lessons?
I
And
think that would be really helpful, and no one is doing that, Rivera, and you have a really good sense of that. There's so many things you could talk about, but Ken could give you some other clues. Um, do you know about the reverse strikes, Rivera? Yeah, so that could be included too. I know that that is happening in some places. Anyway, wonderful. Do you see any other questions you want to answer there in the chat, Rivera, or shall I
sure.
just?
Yeah, so Al, you asked about what's the first tool, book, video, or game that you would recommend I share with my grandkids. That depends on their age a little bit, but my favorite movie is Moana. I think it is one of the most profound nonviolent movies that Disney has ever produced. If your kids are 10 years old, the Ariara series is a great fantasy series for them to read. If your grandkids are, teenagers, show them A Force More Powerful, the documentary. I think that's a great place for anyone to start learning about nonviolent struggle. And yeah, if you guys want to keep abreast of what's happening in current movements, I also put the link to Nonviolence News in the chat box. You can sign up for that newsletter. It's free, and we share 30 to 50 stories of nonviolence in action from around the world every single week in a really digestible newsletter. So if you only have like 30 seconds, you can literally open it and scan it and, get at least the headlines.
And what's that email? How do you sign up for it? Or the website?
Nonviolencenews.org, and it's in the chat box for people. You can also get to it on my website as well.
That's so wonderful. Rivera, I just, it was just so wonderful and brilliant and moving. I kept thinking about other stories and all, and nonviolent direct action in particular, like the different ingredients that go into these movements that bring something spectacular. And I wonder if you've thought about that. So, every sector of society has to be involved in the end for a nonviolent movement to kind of win out, from teachers to doctors to church people. You know what I mean? The whole society needs to, that's very helpful to teach people that everyone can play a part wherever you are. But Howard Zinn, and I wonder if you, so there's a question, what did you learn from Jim Lawson? Or you could say, what did you learn from Howard Zinn? Howard Zinn told me that in every movement, you need a front line of people breaking laws. You don't need the majority to do that, but you do need somebody to non-violently break laws and accept the consequences. And he would say, he would go through the movements in US history. Any thoughts on that? And I noticed I don't think you mentioned the Vietnam War. I wonder if that was intentional. And I wonder what you think about this, and David too. I tried really hard to reach Ken Burns when he was doing his Vietnam PBS series, because he left out so much of the movement. And he very deliberately did not include Catonsville 9, which led to 350 nonviolent direct actions on the draft board raids, which I think is the reason why the war ended. Because all throughout New England and the Northeast, there were no more files. No one could be drafted. They couldn't run the war. They were gone. Their papers were burned. And no one talks about that. And there's a documentary about that, Rivera, Hit and Stay, which you might want to watch if you haven't seen it. Any thoughts on these things? This is what I was thinking when you're speaking.
Yeah, I could have included the Vietnam War in these story sets, but you know what I don't is actually every single person on this call, I think, probably has more of a direct experience with that particular story than I do.
Yeah.
It's pretty well known, so I choose to bring in some stories that maybe we don't know quite as well. But
Great.
yeah, reflecting on what you've seen and lived through and heard about, it can really reveal a lot of the great tactics that were used in that effort. And then the question, Kathy brought it up in the chat box, what's the most significant thing you learned from Jim Lawson throughout the years? Is two things. One, you need a campaign, not just a protest and then another protest, and not just a big, bold vision of a movement. You need to break it down and find a tangible goal that achieves one piece of what you want to do on the big plan. Then you need to go for it with tactics that match your strategy. So the importance of a specific campaign, not just keep going to protests. The other thing that Jim Lawson, Reverend Lawson taught me is the importance of intergenerational movements, that without our elders and without our youngers, and everybody in between, we are lost. We are lost as a society and we are lost as movements. So making ways for the wisdom of all ages to be in our groups together and our movements makes us stronger and wiser and more energetic and richer as a movement culture.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Rivera. We have about 2 minutes left. Is there any other pressing question or any other closing comment, Rivera?
I guess I could just say, oh, go ahead, John.
No, go ahead.
I guess I could just say that, a lot of my work has to do with writing new stories and telling better stories. And it is a great privilege and honor in my life to live at a time when the stories are so accessible, when great research has been done, when, Gene Sharp categorized all these things, when we have a force more powerful and myriad documentaries about this stuff, when the Global Nonviolent Action Database has over 1,000 case studies to learn from. And I have made studying nonviolent struggles one of the things that I do in my life, and I will never stop, because we live in times when we need these stories, when everything seems bleak. And when we look at the big story of human history, we are at the crux moment. It may end. It may end in this next chapter. And whether or not this is a tragedy or a heroic victory lap comes down to this moment right now, the next 5 to 10 years. So that can feel overwhelming until we remember these people on the ground of the stories that we just shared. Right? How do you think it felt to be in Algeria blocking a tank? How do you think it felt to be one of the women of Liberia who sat down in front of the door? How do you think it felt to be in the People Power Revolution, in the streets, stopping the armies from colliding? We have to be ready in these lifetimes of ours to live that way, to navigate those moments, to accept that that might be why we are here, one of the reasons that we are here. And to remember that many of us on this call have been those people before. And so may we all stand with them again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You've given us all a great gift and a great hope and inspiration, and you're a brilliant teacher. And I hope everyone will tell people about Rivera's work, invite her to come and speak, share this YouTube recording far and wide. It'll be posted, I think, later in the summer, and support Rivera's work. How about a big round of applause for our teacher, Rivera's son? Thank you very much, Rivera. You've done great. And can I count on you for a year from now coming back and give us part 2, however you want to?
Sure.
That's great. Okay. And so just a little commercial announcement then. So our next Zoom is July 13th with Sister Ann McCarthy, who's going to do a Zoom on our close friend, Sister Mary Lou Kalnacki, who died 2 years ago. She was one of the founding leaders of Pax Christi. And as far as I know, the very first person ever who started to teach and talk about a spirituality of nonviolence. Nobody had done that before. This was in the 70s. So Anne is going to present like the 10 key teachings of Mary Lou's spirituality of nonviolence. Mary Lou was a Benedictine nun with Joan Chittister. So I think it's going to be a really nice complement to everything Rivera has said today. What is the spiritual grounding to go and live the movement? Another thing, just to maybe close with the gift you've given us, Rivera, I first learned from Howard Zinn, which is just to say it again, the power of all of us ordinary people. We have so much more power. And Howard Zinn said that in the end, all movements that succeeded or got their goal was because ordinary people didn't give up. They just kept at it, even if they weren't going to live to see the victory they sought. They just did this for the rest of their lives. And that's one of my hopes from your presentation, Rivera, is that you'll inspire all of us just to keep doing this, to work for the abolition of war and injustice and nukes and racism and environmental destruction, whether we live to see any victories or not, that we're just going to keep at it like Jim Lawson, who was so faithful. So you've given us all a great gift. Thank you very much. I'm going to sign off now. Rivera, I'll say goodbye, presuming you'll get to go and have a nice afternoon. But if anyone wants to stay on a few minutes, you're very welcome. Okay, peace, everybody. God bless you. And see you the next time, Rivera. I can't figure out how to sign off the recording. Okay, bye.